Hello everyone, this is Heather Benucci coming to you from Washington, D.C. in the Office of English Language Programs at the U.S. State Department. Today we're going to be exploring the topic of using evidence in academic writing, avoiding plagiarism. And this is a topic, as I hope you will see, is particularly relevant to teachers and learners of the English language. So let's get started. All right, what do we need to do today? Let's take a look at our objectives. First, we're going to spend some time looking at how culture can affect our interpretations, applications, and enforcement of plagiarism-related concepts. We're also going to discuss the relationship between claims and evidence in academic writing, how the two are related, and how they're linked to the idea of plagiarism. And we're also going to explore 3 different ways to include evidence in your academic writing. These are going to be quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. And last but not least, as we go along, we want to make sure that we're looking at these topics through our EFL classroom lens. So we're going to focus on 2 questions. Why can using evidence be tricky for English language learners? And what can we as teachers do to help our students deal with this challenge? So to start off today, I'd like to share some quotes that are linked to plagiarism with you. Let's take a look, and I'd be interested to see reactions in the chat box. So in the upper left, we have a quote from Wendell Phillips, who was an American abolitionist, somebody that fought against the idea of slavery. He said, "In every matter that relates to invention, to use, or beauty or form, we are borrowers." Next, on the right, we have a quote from an ancient Roman playwright known as Terence. He said, "Nothing is said which has not been said before." And finally, from an Irish writer named Jonathan Swift, we have the quote, "Fine words, wonder where you stole them." So, do any of these quotes make you think about ideas related to plagiarism? Let's see some of your ideas in the chat box. And as you're thinking about the quote that you can see here, I'd also like to know your definition of plagiarism. So please share those in the chat box as well. Great, lots of ideas coming up there. I see a lot of people are interested in quote number 2 there by Terence, believing that we all are borrowers, that most things that are said now have been said or at least thought about in the past. Okay, well, thank you for sharing your definitions. Now let's take a look at a definition that was provided in a forum article that is on the Ning for you all by Jennifer Mott Smith. This author shares a definition for plagiarism that's given by Towson University, which is actually close by here in the state of Maryland here in the US. And their academic integrity policy claims that plagiarism is presenting the work, product, ideas, or words of another as one's own. And to get more specific about that, we have to acknowledge a source. In other words, we have to provide a citation, make sure that the reader knows where the information is coming from. Whenever we quote another person's actual words or replicate, copy the work of another, and that includes from sources such as the internet, that could be an entire webinar on its own. So we're not going to get too much into issues of the internet and plagiarism today, but know that citations are in fact required when things do come from the internet. That surprises some students. The second point here is that sources have to be acknowledged if we use another person's ideas, opinions, work, etc., even if we put their work into our own words. So if we paraphrase or summarize, we still have to give the original person or author credit. So these 2 subpoints here deal with 2 aspects of acknowledging sources or ways of using sources. The first point relates to direct use. So by quoting someone, I'm using their actual word-for-word statements. The second one deals with indirect use. I'm putting their ideas, their work, into my own phrases, my own words. So that would be indirect use. And the final point of this definition relates to sort of non-text examples, such as pictures, charts, and graphics. Students are often surprised that they do have to supply the source information for pictures. And again, this can even be pictures that are found on the internet. So now that we have a detailed definition, let's look at where you might find this if you're a student. Most U.S. universities, actually all U.S. universities I would go as far as to say, and many secondary schools in the United States have academic integrity codes. So if you go to one of these institutions, you agree to follow this policy. Academic integrity code, you'll also see it called an honor code, an anti-plagiarism policy. These are all different rules and regulations that institutions have for letting students know what's expected for them in terms of ensuring the integrity, the honesty of their own academic work. Well, what does this look like to students? You can see here on the screen just a very small part of an academic integrity code. This example is from American University, which is here in Washington, D.C. The entire thing is about, I think, about 7 or 8 pages long. So this can be really overwhelming for students. Do we think that a student would sit down and read 7 or 8 pages of rules and regulations? Well, actually, they kind of have to, because I know you can't see the small print, so I'll read you some of the wording, but the responsibility to comply rests with the students. So the students have to follow the rules. So to give you an example, this academic integrity code says, by enrolling in American University, students acknowledge their commitment to this code. As members of the academic community, they must become familiar with their rights and responsibilities. They are responsible for knowing the requirements and restrictions. It goes on to say students are responsible for learning the conventions of documentation and acknowledging sources. So it doesn't say that this university must teach students how to do it. It says students are expected to know how to do this. So especially for students that are coming to the U.S. from overseas who might have different expectations about how to cite and use sources in their work, coming face to face with this long academic integrity code and what it actually means in their daily writing can be a big challenge. So now that I've discussed the standard for academic codes here in the U.S., I'd be interested to learn more about how things work where you are. So let's take a poll. So the first question that I'm interested in seeing your responses to is, does your school, institution, or your own classroom have a policy about plagiarism or academic integrity? And if you do, the second question asks, how do students know about this policy? That could be everything from what we just saw, where the policy is on a website, and if a student goes to the school, it's assumed that they will agree, to students maybe have to sign a contract acknowledging the policy, or perhaps teachers take the time to provide lessons or activities related to plagiarism and how to avoid it. So if you have a plagiarism policy, how do your students learn about it, and how do they learn how to avoid plagiarism? Oh, great. I'm seeing a lot of variety in answers here, which is to be expected, as we'll see in our next topic here. Thank you for sharing your comments. Let's go back to the presentation, please. So to paraphrase the definition from Towson University that we saw a bit earlier, and note that even though I'm paraphrasing at the bottom of the screen, I'm still citing the source and letting you know where I got my information. Plagiarism is using someone else's words, ideas, or data without credit. And even when we are not quoting directly, when we're summarizing or paraphrasing, we still have to give original authors credit. So that's pretty straightforward, huh? Everybody got a clear idea now of what plagiarism is? Do you think it would be okay to just give students this definition and expect them to understand how to implement these ideas in their writing? I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think that there are a lot of assumptions in this definition that we just looked at together. Can you please share your ideas in the chat box as to what some of these assumptions might be? Oh, I see somebody says yes, that this is an issue related to honesty and its morality, and it's something that has to be policed. That's definitely one example. Let's look at some examples that I came up with. First and foremost, the definition assumes that ideas have owners, that there's a property to things, our work and our data. So that's a huge assumption that's not shared universally. Next, the idea that crediting a source, so referencing, is required even when we're summarizing and using our own words. Next, as somebody said earlier, that plagiarism is a moral issue. There's a question of right and wrong, of honesty, and if you do plagiarize, it is a matter of your integrity. And finally, there's an expectation culturally that the source of ideas have to be very clearly documented in academic writing. Readers of academic writing expect to know which thoughts belong to the author and which thoughts came from other sources. So how can this affect our EFL students who come from a variety of cultures? I think there are two good articles up on the Ning for you to examine. One is by Moody and the other is by Mott Smith. Each of these articles gives examples from students from several locations, especially across Asia and the Middle East are many of the examples. And they talk about how their own individual students have had cultural difficulty with taking on some of the assumptions that we just discussed in the last slide. The first of which is this idea that some other cultures view knowledge as a shared belonging. It's shared wisdom. It doesn't belong to just one person. It belongs to a group, a civilization, a culture. Another issue can be is that expert texts are seen as sort of unquestioned authorities. They're actual truth versus claims in an academic conversation. So perhaps how we treat the source information might be different. Also, memorizing directly and reproducing is seen as a very valid way of both learning and a learning method and also an assessment method. Depending on the importance of a text, so perhaps it's a religious text, an important national poem, or other book, the verbatim, word for word respect for that original text is important, and it would be considered very very bold, very presumptuous to change that text and put it into your own words to basically appropriate or take ownership of something that's considered to be so highly respected. And finally, in terms of how we show our mastery of academic material, in many cultures, it's not expected that we take an individual position on the material. In many cases, you show your mastery through your ability to reproduce very closely to the original this material. And finally, some students have learned that their goal as writers is to seamlessly meld, and this is discussed specifically in the article by Mott Smith. It is their goal to combine so the reader can't even tell which thoughts are the author's and which thoughts are from outside sources, that they want to produce a seamless product to meld their ideas directly with the work of the experts. And that's what they've been told in the past is good writing. So to just hand someone, again, a definition of what is or isn't plagiarism, especially when we're dealing with students from many different countries, might not be the best way to approach this very important issue. So something I haven't mentioned yet is that there are very serious consequences in the world of English language academic writing for those who do plagiarize. This can be everything from perhaps being given a failing grade to being removed from a school. If you're in a professional field, it can be seen as a problem with your credibility, and perhaps you will not be able to get another job in the academic field. It also affects those that write books and write for newspapers. So there can be very serious penalties for plagiarism. So considering these serious penalties, I think it's quite important in the face of cultural assumptions that teachers have to go below the surface with their students that are English language learners and really figure out what their students need to know to succeed. Part of this is acknowledging and helping their students recognize that referencing, again, this is the idea of using citations, referring to outside sources, it's a very key aspect of the English language academic genre. And so a quick review for those that were not joining us or that did not join us for unraveling the mysteries of academic writing. Can anyone remind me in the chat box what a genre is? That's right, it's a subset or a style of writing that has its own conventions, rules, and expectations. So within the academic genre in English language writing, referencing is considered to be an important factor within the genre. And it seems like a very complicated task, and it actually is. There's a lot to remember, but I think we teachers can unpack this complicated system and make it a skill that our students can master. And I'd like to point out that most plagiarism by English language learners is not malicious. It's not done from a bad place. It's not intentional, an honesty or ethics violation where they just say, oh, I'm going to copy this paper from the internet and turn it in with my name on it. In most cases of plagiarism with academic writing and English language learners, it comes from a lack of comfort with the requirements of the academic genre. And often students are experimenting with language. They're doing some linguistic borrowing, which is also called patch writing. Again, you can find out more about patch writing in the articles you see in the bottom right corner by Moody and by Mott Smith. It's sort of a bootstrapping technique where language learners test out little bits of language, chunks of language that strike them, and try to use them in their own writing. And depending on how much borrowing is done, it can actually cross the line over into perceived plagiarism. So to keep students out of trouble, we need some explicit instruction on genre characteristics and teach students how to incorporate evidence, the work of others, according to the accepted standards within the academic writing community. So let's take a closer look at the genre. Academic writers are a part of a discourse community that has shared standards. And academic writing can be seen or thought of as a conversation, and not just between the writer and the sources, but also the writer and the readers. We talked a lot about this in our Unraveling the Mysteries of Academic Writing webinar. So as being part of this conversation, writers are expected to bring something new to the table, to add something to the field of scholarship. And we talked about this in the last webinar through the process of finding a gap, establishing your niche, what you can bring to the table, filling that gap. So what do you have to offer to the conversation? And ideas are expressed in response to what has already been done. And writers also use the work of others to support their ideas. So how do we help English language learners join this conversation? We're going to focus on two things for the rest of this webinar. One is emphasizing this idea that there's a format that's expected in the genre, which is they say, other authors, I say, the current writer. There's going to be two different voices in a paper, and they need to be kept separate very explicitly. And also related to this concept is the relationship between claims and evidence, which we are going to take a closer look at now. So claims and evidence, what's the difference? I'd like to see some of your ideas in the chat box, please. You can give an example perhaps of a claim or evidence or how you might use them. Okay, great. I see lots of good ideas here. Let's double check. A claim is a writer's idea or argument. So if we're talking about a research paper perhaps, what would be the biggest claim the master claim in the paper? Any ideas? Oh, I see it there in the chat box. Thesis, exactly. So what about evidence? Evidence is information that supports a claim. So another way to think about this relationship for visual people who like, oops, my graphic didn't come out. I'll have to address this. There is a relationship between the two where you can think about a table. The evidence would be the legs of the table that is holding up or supporting a claim. All right, we'll make sure we get that technical problem fixed. So claims and evidence, you can't have one without the other, as the title said. There is an expectation within the academic writing genre that there will be balance. So let's look first at what happens when we have claims without evidence. We have an example that says, the internet is ruining society. Nobody writes letters anymore. Tweeting and texting are damaging our writing skills. We don't see any kind of citations in there. So as a reader, what kind of questions or response do you have towards those kinds of claims? It just seems like the author is saying, hey, believe me because I said so. There's no outside information there giving that support to these claims, these ideas, these arguments. So how do we fix them? We need to support our claims with the work of others. Let's look at the reverse case where we have evidence without claims. So here we have a quote from Susan Smith, and she's saying that Fiji is just one example. Until TB was introduced in 1995, islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. And pretend we had, 3 or 4 more quotes about women and dieting in a row. What does that make you feel as the reader? Perhaps, so what? Why are you telling me this? What does this information mean? In order to achieve balance, again, we need to relate that evidence to a claim. So apart from using evidence to support claims and giving credibility, there's some other reasons to use what other authors say, what they say. It's important to situate our writing, as we said. So citing the work of others helps show how the current piece of writing relates to what's already been done in the field. It also provides a variety of viewpoints, acknowledges that I, the writer, have done my homework and that I'm trying to be unbiased by showing you the work and points of views of others. And you can also use evidence to call attention to a position that you agree with or disagree with that you want to make an argument about within a paper. And finally, occasionally you'll come across wording or phrasing that is extremely striking or unusual. It catches your attention, and a great way to incorporate that evidence into your paper is through a quotation, as we'll see. So now let's look at a few of the vehicles, the tools we can use for bringing evidence into our academic writing. What we have here is a chart that's going to talk about 3 qualities of ways to use evidence that includes paraphrasing, quoting, and summarizing. And let's see if we can match those topics with the proper column A, B, or C. So first, looking at citations, for column A, we have to reference the author and the year. Same for column B. And for column C, we have to give the author, year, and page number as well. So page number is the difference. All right, what about text length? For column A, the text is shorter than the original text, much shorter in fact. For column B, the text can be shorter or longer. Column C, the text is exactly the same length as the original text. And finally, phrasing. For column A, you have to use your own words and phrases and perhaps very limited use of quotations. Column B, you have to use your own words again. And if you use any phrases, short pieces, you have to put quotations around them. And finally, for column C, you have to use the original author's exact words, and you must put quotation marks around the original. That might be a clue. Put quotation marks around the original. So take a moment, looking down the columns A, B, and C, which goes with paraphrasing, which goes with quoting, which goes with summarizing. What do we think for A? I see a lot of people saying summarizing. How about B? Paraphrasing? Yep, you're right. And finally, gives it away, last one, C, quoting. Exactly. So to sum it up, looking along the bottom here, summarizing gives a main idea, a very broad view. So you could summarize an entire paper. You can also summarize a paragraph. Again, the big picture ideas. Paraphrasing usually focuses on single ideas and short passages, and we're going to look at some examples in a moment. And finally, quotations, they can be long, they can be short, but they have to be exactly the same as the original text. So let's do an example here. We have a piece of an original text. I'll read it out loud once, and then we're going to look at some examples of quotations, paraphrasing, and summarizing, and you're going to tell me which is which. So our original text here states, students frequently overuse direct quotation in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final research paper. Probably only 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount of exact transcribing of source materials while taking notes. Good advice for our English language learning students. So now let's try an example. We go to the secondary poll window, please. Thank you. So at the top in blue text, you can see the original that we just read together. And then below, your job is to answer, paraphrase, summary, or quotation for each of the items, thinking about that chart with the characteristics that we just looked at. So let's take a few minutes, and I'll be quiet and let you read while you choose which is which for items 1, 2, and 3. Okay, let's check our answers here. All right, great work, everyone. Number 1 is a paraphrase. As you can see, we've got the author and the year there. The text level in terms of the amount of text is about the same, but we're focusing on specific ideas here. This is almost equivalent to the original. For number 2, which is a quotation, we have what? The author, the year, the page number. That was a different thing on our chart, right? And we have our quotation marks and exact wording taken from the original text. And finally, number 3, our summary, is much shorter than the original text, and it captures the essence, that big picture main idea, right? Great. Let's go back to the presentation, please. So I'll give you a moment to review the chart here, the comparison chart. The tricky thing sometimes can be the difference between summarizing and paraphrasing. Again, it's the amount of detail that's provided and the focus. Is it a broad main idea or is it a single idea? So now that we've reviewed the differences and similarities among these three, I have a couple more poll questions for you. Which technique for using evidence do you think is the easiest for EFL students? Quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing? And then looking at things from your perspective as a teacher, which is the most difficult referencing technique to teach to EFL students? Oh, I see a lot of people saying quoting is easiest for EFL students, and paraphrasing is quite difficult to teach. I have to agree with you from my experience. I found the exact same thing. So let's go back to the presentation, please. And we'll start with the easy one, relatively easy one, which is quotations. So even though we just said that it's probably the easiest for EFL students, Could there still be some problems? What might they be? Let's share your answers in the chat box, please. Those are great ideas. I agree with many of them. Thank you for sharing. Here is a list that I developed. The first of which is overusing quotations. This is a huge temptation for EFL students because the original said it so well. It's in beautiful English. Why would I want to do anything but use those exact same words? So as we saw in our example text from our exercise a moment ago, probably not more than 10% of a paper should be quotations. I've seen some that are as much as 50, 60, 70%, which can be, again, that out of balance between claims and evidence situation. Other things can be quoting out of context, making changes or deletions to quotations, and finally, either not citing a quote or improperly citing a quotation. Again, we need that page number usually when we're citing a quotation. So let's look at 3 activities we can do with our students to help them with some of these problems. One, the first there is a demonstration type of activity. Give your students, and perhaps you can use papers that you've collected from other students in the past and anonymize them, take the names off, and perhaps ask their permission if they can be used. But show students an unbalanced paper that is one of those 70% quote papers. Ask them to go through and highlight or underline the author's claims, and ask them, how does it make them feel as a reader that there are so many quotes in the paper? Do you get a clear idea of the writer's argument and position? Usually the answer will very clearly be no. It looks like a patchwork of many ideas from others. That one's fairly straightforward. We're going to look in a bit more depth at 2 other types of tasks, the first of which is an acceptability task and also an inductive analysis task. So an acceptability task might look something like this. Let's focus first on the bottom half of the screen below the line. So you would give your students a stretch of text and the following instructions. Look at the quotes, decide if they're acceptable, yes or no, and if they're not acceptable, correct them. So 3 steps. So since I can't give you an entire text here on one webinar slide, I gave you just this sentence associated with this quotation, and again, this activity is adapted from the article by Mott Smith that's available on the Ning. So let's look at example A here. Do you all think that this is an acceptable or unacceptable quotation? I see a lot of people saying unacceptable. Let's see, why do you think it's unacceptable? They left out some words. That is exactly right. So here you could see an example of a corrected text. You have to have, again, a quotation exact match between the original and the quotation. So you have to include those pieces of word, or excuse me, include those words. Let's try another example. Again, looking at the bottom, we have item B. Is this an example of an acceptable or unacceptable quotation? If not, why? And the sentence you're looking at to speed things up is the blue text above. People seem to have differing opinions on this one. Those that said unacceptable are correct. Why? The quote as given at B there leaves out "they say with disarming logic." So if we want to leave the quote as it is shown, we can use a tool called ellipses, those 3 little blue dots you see there. That lets the reader know that something has been taken out, removed from the original quote. And finally, one more acceptability task. C. How about this one? Acceptable or unacceptable? Oh, I see a lot of people saying this one's okay. I'm not trying to trick you, and many of my students in similar cases have said the same thing. This is not an acceptable quotation. It's really, really close, but the quotation changes the number 500 to the words 500 and the word 12 to the number 12. So even something that doesn't change the meaning, it has to be exactly the same for quotation. So this is an example of an acceptability task that take students beyond, oh, yes, no, this seems okay to me, and ask them to figure out why and to correct the issue, something that can be very valuable as they're checking their own work. All right, next, inductive analysis test. Task. I will show you a tool that you can use here, a graphic organizer, that involves some follow-up questions. And the goal here is to help students discover how quotations are used and cited by examining them in context in a stretch of long text. So that is one of the benefits. They are not just learning a bunch of individual rules. They get to see and experience how quotations are used in actual writing. And the inductive nature applies to different learning styles. Some students like to discover rules for themselves inductively. Others like to be given rules and test them out. They're deductive learners. So let's take a look. Here is a graphic organizer you can use for inductive analysis. At the top, students would fill in the author, title, and date of the article you give them. Again, we want our students to become good note takers and capture this information for their sources. On the left-hand side, you'll see the article's page number from where each citation comes from. So the first one that comes on page 47 of the article. The citation for the quote, you can see there, Smith 99, page 324. And why is this quote here? Why did the author use the quote? Oh, it's got statistical data, perhaps that supports the argument. And you can see another example there below from a citation by Park and Choi. So follow-up questions, in addition to this graphic organizer, can include questions about what's the format for citing. They'll have a list of perhaps 20 citations, and it should be very clear that it would be author, year, page number. That would be the pieces of information you need. And then you can also give students a sense of how much quotation, or how many quotations, are acceptable. Again, we're looking for 10% roughly or less. So did this author adhere to that general rule that perhaps you've shared previously? And finally, what did the author quote? Phrases, sentences, long passages. So this is a discovery-based activity that involves some critical thinking, and it really helps solidify concepts in the learner's minds instead of just asking them to memorize a list of rules. All right, so that's activities for quotations. Now let's try something a bit more difficult, paraphrasing and summarizing. As we've discussed, similar skills are going to be involved. The difference is the focus, right, the depth. As a review quickly, which one is main ideas? Summarizing, yep. That means paraphrasing would be defining an idea or a passage, okay? So my question to you is, what do teachers usually tell students who have to write a summary or have to paraphrase a text? The thing I hear all the time is, put it into your own words. Could this be a problem for our English language learners? Let's see. I say yes. I've seen it firsthand. English language learners have some challenges perhaps that aren't faced by native speakers. There's some lexical limits, vocabulary limits. Students often say, well, I don't know how else to say it. How am I supposed to put it in my own words? Also, I've already talked about that desire to overuse quotations. Students will say, well, the original author said it in perfect English. They said it better than me. Why should I say it in my own words? And the most confusing question is, can I keep some of the words? Do I have to replace every single word? So definitely some challenges both on the lexical side and on the interpretation side. Do you have any other ideas for challenges that EFL students might face with paraphrasing and summarizing? Oh, definitely. Great. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so considering those challenges for paraphrasing, let's now go take a look at a video. This is from Professor David Taylor at American Intercontinental University, and he's going to discuss tips for paraphrasing.
You know, whenever you use a source in something that you're writing, whether that source is a journal article, a website, a book, or whatever, you have two choices in terms of how you use that source. You can either quote from it using the author's direct words and putting them in quotation marks, or you can paraphrase from it. Let's talk about this word paraphrase. You've probably heard it explained to you as, quote, putting it in your own words. Well, that's about half right. Sometimes less, sometimes more. You see, whenever you paraphrase, you can't really put something completely in your own words. You can put it into your own phrases, your own sentences, because you will have to repeat certain key words. Let me give you an example. Let's look at this. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, which covered large portions of Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee under 30 feet of water, is considered the most destructive river flood in United States history. Citation, fatal flood. Now, if you're going to paraphrase that, you can't put it entirely into your own words. How else are you going to say Louisiana, or Mississippi, or Kentucky, or flood, or 1927? You have to use certain key words. So the issue is not putting something 100% into your own words. The issue is putting it into your own voice, your own phrases, your own sentences. Let's take a look at a good paraphrase of that quotation. In 1927, the Great Mississippi Flood drowned sections of 6 states, including Louisiana, and is still considered as the worst our country has ever known. Citation, fatal flood. So as you see, I repeated certain key words, and that's just fine, because I put it into my own sentence, my own phrases, my own voice. Now, another question. Why go to all this trouble of paraphrasing something? Why not just quote everything? Well, there are 2 answers. One, by paraphrasing it, by putting it into your own voice, your own sentences, it's going to flow better into your paper, and your reader is going to be able to better follow what you're saying. And the second reason, of course, is that you must limit the number of quotations that you use in your paper, or else it's going to sound like somebody else wrote it, that you just copied and pasted, and that's not a good thing. Now, final point, whether you quote something or whether you paraphrase it, putting it into your own phrases, you always must cite it.
Okay, so this video again was from YouTube. It's available on the Ning by Professor David Taylor. There's lots of great resources both by Professor Taylor and others that can provide a nice change of pace in class to give the teacher a break and give students a chance to hear another voice or ideas on topics such as summarizing, paraphrasing, and using quotations. So I think Professor Taylor acknowledges this idea of you have to go beyond putting it in your own words. And I'm going to use a lot of ideas also from Cristin Boyd, who teaches at San Jose State University in California. She has developed a lot of concepts related to teaching, paraphrasing, and summarizing through effective reading, that students should focus on ideas, not individual words. So let's look at the middle section here and acknowledge that paraphrasing is really more than just using lots of synonyms and swapping around grammar. We want to focus on getting that idea. So let's look at A, and this is a statistic I totally made up. I don't know if it's true. California accounts for 78% of the citrus produce grown in the U.S. The paraphrase is there. B, in the United States of America, a vast majority of round acidic fruit is farmed in the largest state on the West Coast. My question, is B an acceptable paraphrase of A? No, I don't think we all agree that the second one sounds kind of silly and strange. But believe it or not, I've had students who had been told put it in your own words. They think that it means you just have to come up with synonyms, move around the grammar. And we can all see that the results end up sounding kind of silly, disjointed. Not good English at the end of the day. Again, that's in quotations, the good English piece. So for our students, think we'll see through some examples that efficient and fluent reading will help them with their summarizing skills and their paraphrasing skills as well. So take a moment and think about how you read. Do you do bottom-up processing when you're reading? Are you reading word for word, or are you reading for ideas? What is the unit of an idea, the unit of meaning in English? Is it the word? Right, it's usually paragraphs. So let's take a look at Cristin Boyd's tips for readers. She suggests that good readers take the time to identify the overall main idea, and they keep this main idea in mind as they read. And as I just said, the main idea level in English is the paragraph. So read at the paragraph level and determine the key idea for each. And English language learners shouldn't try to read every word or directly translate word for word. This can become A, really time consuming, and B, you get caught up in the individual words meanings and you're not looking for those ideas. So her suggestion is that learners should make a running list of key words that they see over and over again in a text, and that they should only look up words that fall into this keyword list. Because those are going to be key to understanding the main ideas. Cristin Boyd also suggests that readers go through quickly several times instead of painstakingly and slowly once. And as you go back and reread, try to focus again on ideas and not words. There's a handout on the Ning that gives a lot of details on these techniques. I hope you will find it useful. And Cristin Boyd translates these ideas about reading for ideas into her 7 steps for paraphrasing well, which I think is a great system for introducing the concept and the how-to behind the scenes of paraphrasing to English language learning students. So the first step is, sounds the same, right? Read your passage, the short piece, over and over again to understand the main idea. Make that keyword list and also note down proper names. So that could be place names, as we saw in the video example with state names. It could be people's names. The next step is the most important. Cover the original text. Take it out of your sight and restate the main idea. And you do this without worrying about grammar or sentence structure. Why might we want to take away the original when we do this step? That's exactly right. It reduces the temptation to borrow phrases, to do that patch writing. It really makes you focus on coming up with original phrasing. So after we captured that idea, compare your paraphrase to the original one. Make sure that it's not too similar, that you haven't picked up any phrases or wording directly. Now is the time, at that point, once you've captured the idea and ensured it's different enough, to go back and check your sentence structure and proofread and edit your paraphrase. Again, there's a handout on these steps on the Ning from Cristin Boyd that you can print out and use in class directly with your students. So taking these principles into some activities, the first we'll look at is called Paraphrase on the Run. This can be a very fun way of taking what can be sometimes a boring task related to academic writing and making it a bit more enjoyable for our learners. So the teacher will take short text passages, perhaps paragraphs at the longest, and cut them up and post them outside the classroom. If your classroom space allows you, and you have a hallway, or maybe you could do it on one side of the classroom, but have a dedicated space where you would post the original text. Then students are broken up into pairs. One person in the pair is the runner. They're going to go outside and read the text. The teacher's going to time them and give them a very short time limit. Enough time to read through for ideas, perhaps read again for ideas, but not enough time for students to memorize chunks of the text. The person then runs back into the classroom, tells their partner, the scribe, orally the meaning of the short text, and then the two work together to write a paraphrase using those 7 steps to paraphrasing well. And then the last step would be to go and pull your original text back into the classroom, check your paraphrase against the original. So what are some of the benefits of this type of activity? Yep, it gets the students out of their seats. That's the first one I came up with as well. It's active, It's communicative. Students have to talk with each other to negotiate to develop a paraphrase. So they're collaborating, working together. And I think most importantly is it involves oral communication. Traditionally, paraphrasing is done writing to writing, text to text. Students are given a written text and asked to write a paraphrase. Here, our English language learners are asked to orally communicate the idea, and this means that they are not going to be perhaps as focused on the grammar if they're not looking directly at the text and they're speaking. So no focus on single words as well because they're timed. They only have a certain amount of time to read the original text and come back and share the ideas with their partners. So a creative way, again, this is from Cristin Boyd, to bring paraphrasing into the active learning realm. Let's look at another activity for paraphrasing. This one's called read to retell. I adapted this one. In this case, we're having the class read a short text using the reading for ideas strategy. And then next, each student is going to be given a part of the text. They have a time, again, we don't want them to have time to memorize, but time to reread. Text is put away. Working in pairs, the students orally paraphrase their sections with a partner. So one partner will paraphrase his paragraph, the next partner will paraphrase her paragraph, and then since everybody's read the entire longer text together, they can ask each other if they're missing details. They can give some prompting. So as a teacher, you might say, oh, what about the part about acid rain, for example? And the person say, oh, yeah, I left that out of my paraphrase. So again, similar benefits to paraphrase on the run, except there's no running, which perhaps is less fun. But it's focusing on oral language and getting students hooked on ideas, less focus on words, less focus on grammar. All right, and we're going to close up today with some activities and tips for summarizing. Tips for finding the main ideas. First of all, we need to teach our students to be strategic pre-readers, to look for main ideas for an article using clues such as the title, the thesis statement, section headers, and the conclusion paragraphs. Often without reading an entire article, just by looking at those, you can get the main idea. So strategic pre-reading. Students should then read the article once to get the gist and to look for idea breaks. So an idea break is different than a paragraph, perhaps. Sometimes an idea is carried across one paragraph, sometimes two or three. So it helps students to recognize where ideas change within a text. And you can do this by marking. Perhaps draw slash lines or highlight where the author changes from one idea to the next. Another tip could be to have students fill in the sentence out loud, again, oral language. This article is mainly about, and then to go back and read the article one more time with that main idea in mind. And as they're reading, keeping that keyword list that we discussed earlier. So a tool to assist with building summaries is a summary grid. And I've adapted this from a couple of different grids that I've come across and used in the past. Again, at the top, you're going to see getting the students in the habit of good note-taking skills by recording the author, the year, the title, and the page numbers for their article. They're going to leave the second part, overall main idea, blank for now. They're going to use those strategic reading tips and then also look at idea breaks. So which paragraphs, perhaps the first idea goes paragraphs 1 through 3. Then the students would paraphrase the main idea, write down a few essential details, and keep their keyword list, repeated words, phrases, and proper nouns. Do that throughout the entire article, and then using their information in the grid can have a pretty clear picture of what is the main idea of the overall article. So from here we're working from small to big, from detail to big picture idea. So these summary grids, it's important to keep in mind that starting out perhaps a bit easier to scaffold our students is going to be important. We don't want to start them with perhaps the most technical academic article. We want it to be an article that's accessible to the reader, but that still allows the principles of summarizing to be practiced. And students can work on their note-taking skills, as I mentioned, by using these grids individually. And they also get automatic practice on paraphrasing because they have to paraphrase each of those idea breaks. And you can also use summary grids with groups as well. The whole class reads an article, perhaps. The teacher assigns individual students idea break portions. Students fill in the chart for their individual sections. They share their paraphrases for their idea groups. And then together they work to build a summary of the overall main idea article. So Something that is probably traditionally thought of as a tool for an individual can also be used in group work. Last but not least, putting it all together. And this activity is taken from the article by Mott Smith from English Teaching Forum magazine on the Ning. This combines the ideas of summarizing, paraphrasing, or quoting, and also asks the students to kind of go one step further by identifying the function of each type of evidence in the article. So for example, the first reference is listed there in the second column. The student has to identify that, oh, this is a paraphrase, and the function of this quotation. Why is this evidence included? The function in this case is it gives the primary source of data that's being cited by the author. So again, critical thinking skills, it's not just an identify, but it's asking students to look at why. Why is this evidence included, and how does it relate to the claims the author has been making? As I said, students get to see these concepts in context. They also get to see how the writer manipulates or uses this evidence to make it work for his or her argument. And, oh, just one note, students might not need to write out the citation in a grid. They might, if they have a copy, they can underline or highlight. That might make this process go a lot more quickly. But this is a great activity. Again, see more details in Mott Smith's article, but it brings together all the concepts we've talked about today. So, to summarize, plagiarism means different things to different people. I encourage you, if you do have an institutional academic integrity policy, take the time to explore it with your students. Make it more than just a definition that they get handed in a handbook or that's sitting on some webpage. Make it an active part of your classroom. And if your organization doesn't have one, consider working with your students to make a class policy. This will make sure that students understand what's expected from them in the realm of plagiarism and preventing it, and can also serve as a springboard for many types of activities that you could do in a reading and writing class. And finally, I would suggest that students and teachers work together to explore how cultural differences can influence their understanding of plagiarism, especially perhaps if you have students that might be considering studying abroad at a US or English-speaking institution. What could they expect? How does that differ, or is it the same to opinions that exist locally? As I said, most cases of plagiarism by EFL students, and especially ones that I've experienced in my classroom, haven't been students just going out to the internet and copying a paper and putting their name on it. It's been situations where students just lack familiarity with the requirements of the academic writing genre. So for teachers, we have to make sure our students understand writing is a conversation between the writer, other writers, and the reader. Claims and evidence need to be balanced and that they're interrelated, supporting, and that voices are expected to be separate. The reader wants to know what the author says versus what the sources say, and that has to be done clearly through citation, documentation, and referencing. And finally, we need to support our students in mastering these referencing skills and using evidence effectively in their writing. And we can do this through activities and tasks that develop critical reading skills and reading skills that focus on ideas instead of bottom-up processing on words. And we really want to get away, especially with paraphrasing and summarizing, from focusing on the grammar, individual words, and we can do that through activities that involve note-taking in a structured way and graphic organizers that make the ideas jump out at the students. And again, we need to have some sort of classroom activities or lessons that are devoted to how to practice all of these three skills: quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. So with that, I'll close. I'm happy to continue to take your conversation, take the conversation further on the Ning to answer any questions. I'll remind you that the video that we showed, several classroom handouts, websites, and resources are available there for you. And I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.